Former Massachusetts governor and current Utah Senator Mitt Romney is breaking with the Republican Party, announcing he will vote to convict President Trump on abuse of power. That makes Romney the first and potentially only Republican to support removing the president from office.
The verdict is ours to render under our Constitution. The people will judge us for how well and faithfully we fulfill our duty. The grave question the Constitution tasks senators to answer is whether the president committed an act so extreme and egregious that it rises to the level of a high crime and misdemeanor. Yes, he did. The president asked a foreign government to investigate his political rival. The president withheld vital military funds from that government to press it to do so. The president delayed funds for an American ally at war with Russian invaders. The president's purpose was personal and political. Accordingly, the president is guilty of an appalling abuse of public trust. What he did was not perfect. No, it was a flagrant assault on our electoral rights, our national security, and our fundamental values. Corrupting an election to keep oneself in office is perhaps the most abusive and destructive violation of one's oath of office that I can imagine.
Mitt Romney is going to vote to convict the president of Article 1 of the impeachment clause's abuse of power. He will vote to acquit on the obstruction of Congress. This has been something we've been speculating upon for some time, but now he has said that this is going to be what he's going to do. Is it your view that he will be the only Republican to do this?
It is, and Ali, make no mistake about it, we just witnessed something truly historic. Never in a presidential impeachment has a senator of the same party of the president being impeached voted for his removal. You just saw the Mitt Romney there that Republicans, and particularly supporters of his going back to 2010, 2011, have always said was inside there, this man of conscience, someone who's very much guided by his faith, guided by the legacy of his father, the late George Romney, deciding to stand against his party and with what he said was his oath before God to follow his conscience and in this case convict this president. I was struck that he said he wanted to hear from John Bolton, not because he hoped Bolton would have more damning evidence of this president's malfeasance, but that Bolton might tell him something that would allow him to acquit this president. You heard it in his voice, you heard it in his calls that he knows he's going to be attacked by his own party, by his own president, but that he felt like this is something he absolutely had to do to be able to keep his head up before God and before his children and his grandchildren. An absolutely historic moment on the Senate floor just now.
What a remarkable thing. Mark Leibovich, you have just published an article in the New York Times about this with Peter Baker, about the decision and how Mitt Romney came to it. He actually laid the argument out quite well. He spoke, I mean, he seemed to be choking up and holding back tears in saying this, but he was making the case about why he understands the consequence of this. He understands that he will bear the president's abuse as a result. But he mentioned God, he mentioned his faith, he mentioned his trust in the political system as his justification for doing this.
Yeah, I mean, to reiterate what Garrett said, I mean, this is historic, but it's historic not just because he is a Republican senator voting against the president in this case. This is also the Republican nominee from 8 years ago, and it does give you an indication of where the Republican Party has evolved from in 8 short years. I mean, Mitt Romney was the last non-Trump nominee of the Donald Trump Republican Party. So I think that itself is a marker. But clearly, and I was impressed by this earlier when I talked to Senator Romney in his office, very emotional day for him, very emotional issue for him. He obviously agonized over this a great deal. He realizes also that the path ahead for him is going to be quite unpleasant from within his party. Now, he does have the benefit of being at the end of his career, not at the beginning of his career, and also has 5 or 4.5 years before his next election campaign in Utah. But still, a momentous moment for a lot of reasons, both symbolic but also, in the final count, and how the president views this and how the country will view this proceeding.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.
The Constitution established the vehicle of impeachment that has occupied both houses of our Congress these many days. We have labored to faithfully execute our responsibilities to it. We have arrived at different judgments, but I hope we respect each other's good faith. The allegations made in the articles of impeachment are very serious. As a senator juror, I swore an oath before God to exercise impartial justice. I am profoundly religious. My faith is at the heart of who I am. I take an oath before God as enormously consequential. I knew from the outset that being tasked with judging the president, the leader of my own party, would be the most difficult decision I have ever faced. I was not wrong. The House managers presented evidence supporting their case, and the White House counsel disputed that case. In addition, the president's team presented 3 defenses. First, that there could be no impeachment without a statutory crime. Second, that the Biden's conduct justified the president's actions. And third, that the judgment of the president's actions should be left to the voters. Let me first address those 3 defenses. The historic meaning of the words high crimes and misdemeanors, the writings of the founders, and my own reasoned judgment convinced me that a president can indeed commit acts against the public trust that are so egregious that while they are not statutory crimes, they would demand removal from office. To maintain that the lack of a codified and comprehensive list of all the outrageous acts that a president might conceivably commit renders Congress powerless to remove such a president defies reason. The President's counsel also notes that Vice President Biden appeared to have a conflict of interest when he undertook an effort to remove the Ukrainian prosecutor general. If he knew of the exorbitant compensation his son was receiving from a company actually under investigation, the vice president should have recused himself. While ignoring a conflict of interest is not a crime, it is surely very wrong. With regards to Hunter Biden, taking excessive advantage of his father's name is unsavory, but also not a crime. Given that in neither the case of the father nor the son was any evidence presented by the president's counsel that a crime had been committed, the president's insistence that they be investigated by the Ukrainians is hard to explain other than as a political pursuit. There's no question in my mind that were their names not Biden, the president would never have done what he did. The defense argues that the Senate should leave the impeachment decision to the voters. While that logic is appealing to our democratic instincts, it is inconsistent with the Constitution's requirement that the Senate, not the voters, try the president. Hamilton explained that the founders' decision to invest senators with this obligation rather than leave it to the voters was intended to minimize, to the extent possible, the partisan sentiments of the public at large. So the verdict is ours to render under our Constitution. The people will judge us for how well and faithfully we fulfill our duty. The grave question the Constitution tasks senators to answer is whether the president committed an act so extreme and egregious that it rises to the level of a high crime and misdemeanor. Yes, he did. The president asked a foreign government to investigate his political rival. The president withheld vital military funds from that government to press it to do so. The president delayed funds for an American ally at war with Russian invaders. The president's purpose was personal and political. Accordingly, the president is guilty of an appalling abuse of public trust. What he did was not perfect. No, it was a flagrant assault on our electoral rights, our national security, and our fundamental values. Corrupting an election to keep oneself in office is perhaps the most abusive and destructive violation of one's oath of office that I can imagine. In the last several weeks, I've received numerous calls and texts. Many demanded in their words that I stand with the team. I can assure you that that thought has been very much on my mind. You see, I support a great deal of what the president has done. I voted with him 80% of the time. But my promise before God to apply impartial justice required that I put my personal feelings and political biases aside. Were I to ignore the evidence that has been presented and disregard what I believe my oath and the Constitution demands of me for the sake of a partisan end, it would, I fear, expose my character to history's rebuke and the censure of my own conscience. I'm aware that there are people in my party and in my state who will strenuously disapprove of my decision, and in some quarters I will be vehemently denounced. I'm sure to hear abuse from the president and his supporters. Does anyone seriously believe that I would consent to these consequences other than from an inescapable conviction that my oath before God demanded it of me? I sought to hear testimony from John Bolton, not only because I believed he could add context to the charges, but also because I hoped that what he might say could raise reasonable doubt and thus remove from me the awful obligation to vote for impeachment. Like each member of this deliberative body, I love our country. I believe that our Constitution was inspired by Providence. I'm convinced that freedom itself is dependent on the strength and vitality of our national character. As it is with each senator, my vote is an act of conviction. We've come to different conclusions, fellow senators, but I trust we have all followed the dictates of our conscience. I acknowledge that my verdict will not remove the president from office. The results of this Senate court will in fact be appealed to a higher court, the judgment of the American people. Voters will make the final decision, just as the president's lawyers have implored. My vote will likely be in the minority in the Senate. But irrespective of these things, with my vote, I will tell my children and their children that I did my duty to the best of my ability, believing that my country expected it of me. I will only be one name among many, no more, no less, to future generations of Americans who look at the record of this trial. They will note merely that I was among the senators who determined that what the president did was wrong, grievously wrong. We are all footnotes at best in the annals of history, but in the most powerful nation on earth, the nation conceived in liberty and justice, that distinction is enough for any citizen. Thank you, Mr. President. I yield the floor.
Wow, that was extraordinary. That was a moment we haven't seen very often from a member of the U.S. government. That was pure honesty and emotion from Mitt Romney there, talking about how he'd be in the minority voting to convict on both of these charges, presumably with regard to the president. And John Avlon and I have been sitting here, our senior political analyst, and I mean, the words he used, how he said it was the most difficult decision I have ever faced, talked about his faith being at the heart of who I am, talked about the phone calls clearly he'd received from Republicans, stand with the team, but he put politics aside.
That was a true profile and courage speech we just heard. That was the sound of a man who'd wrestled with his conscience, who tried to think bigger than partisan politics, and ultimately kept faith with his oath, his promise to God, as he said, to do impartial justice. And what a contrast between what we just heard from Mitt Romney, doing the difficult thing, doing what he felt was the right thing, even though it's the unpopular thing among his base and among his political party. And you saw the logic. You saw the logic rooted in his understanding of the Constitution, the Founding Fathers, his dismantling of the arguments offered up by the president's defense, saying that this was a grievous abuse of public trust. The only reason the president singled out the Bidens was political purposes.
Yes.
This was a brave, courageous speech. He will catch hell from the right, as he predicted, but that will look on well in the eyes of history.
I want to ask you about that, but I just want to underline your point. That was one of the lines I wrote down. He said, no question, had their names not been Biden, that the President of the United States never would have done what he did. What's Mitt Romney's future? How will the Republicans respond?
As he said, he's been getting phone calls pressuring him. He expects to be denounced by the president, by his supporters, and by many colleagues. But he said he is trying to keep faith, with a higher power, and with the eyes of history, which will ultimately judge his character in this crucial moment. You see already that many of his Republican allies, even those who may agree with him privately, have been afraid to speak out publicly, clearly. They'll say something like, well, it was improper, but not impeachable. They will not vote to remove the president. But he said he had an impartial oath. And as many Republican senators are going to be saying that let's investigate the Bidens, let's carry forward the president's political agenda in the name of retribution, Mitt Romney said very clearly, with conscience and courage of his convictions, I will not be part of that because I do not believe it is honest. I do not believe it is right. I do not believe it is true.